So I'm in the middle of putting this car back together. Owner had a O-ring coolant leak and it drained the coolant system and she cooked it, warped both front and rear heads. So we got a fresh set of heads machined, installed, getting ready to put the intake manifold back on, and I figured while I was doing some quick maintenance on the intake manifold, like replacing some crunchy vacuum lines, that we would take the opportunity to go through and stipulate kind of what is going on back here. A lot of people don't understand, and looking at the picture that's available online isn't necessarily the best way to understand how the system works. So let's go through how it works. Vacuum itself is sourced via that guy right there, and I'll go to where it is over here shortly. But it goes through these two vacuum chambers here. You have your check valve. So it pulls off the intake manifold, goes through the check valve, goes through each one of these vacuum chambers, and there's your vacuum source. It supplies all the vacuum to all of the back of the intake manifold. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as you come through here, and you're this rigid line right here now. So this is your vacuum supply to control all the vacuum solenoids on the back side of the intake manifold. So what that means is at idle, the intake manifold pulls a couple inches of vacuum, which means it's trying to pull air through there. And our little variable resonance induction system uses these little chambers here, which is basically a diaphragm and a cavity on this side and a cavity on this side. And when we apply vacuum to this side, the diaphragm pulls this way, which then opens up the valve, or closes rather. And this one opens up the valves. So when vacuum is present in this line, that means vacuum is then present to each one of the solenoids. So you see we split right here. We come to VRIS number 2. This is number 2 because this one goes back to control this diaphragm right there. And then this here, we've split and we've come to a T, goes down to the EGR solenoids. We'll come back to them. And it comes to VRIS number 1 solenoid. This solenoid here controls this diaphragm there. So pretty simple. So we've got two T's, a T here and a T here to supply vacuum to this solenoid, and this solenoid. Now the EGR system is a little bit more complicated. I'll tell you why. Since this is a spring-loaded diaphragm, it always wants to sit there. So when you apply vacuum to here, it'll pull it. But if you cut vacuum and vent it off, it goes back to normal, because they're spring-loaded. So when you're looking at, let me get another one here. So when you're looking at one of these guys, this is your solenoid right there. So vacuum comes in here, and it's sitting right here. And this little electronic valve, when you apply 12 volts to those two pins, negative, positive, the valve opens up and then vacuum is allowed to pass between here, which means you're pulling on this side through the vacuum line and towards the intake. So through here, through here, through here, down in there, around, and into the intake manifold. So that's where your vacuum actuation comes from. Now, when 12 volts is applied and you're pulling vacuum through like this, and you're done, and you cut 12 volts, then the little valve closes. Well, it closes the connection between here and here. But that means that this side, so some people may not realize this. Let me set you down. Good Lord. Some people may not realize this, but this see that? Here to here is connected. This is a vent. It is designed to keep dust from getting into the thing. So like this, when this is on there, and you have vacuum coming in here, and it goes through there, when you turn it off, it just closes this nipple, which then allows this to vent this way. So it's just a simple mechanism that is a valve that allows vacuum to either be applied here or not. And when a vacuum is not being applied here, it vents it to atmosphere, ATM. Vent to ATM, vent to atmosphere. That's what this guy does. Okay? So it's simple because this guy's spring-loaded. EGR is a two-step. So vacuum comes down here, and it sits here. This guy right here is the one that goes to the EGR, which mounts over here on the rear head. So what this guy is the vent. This is the EGR control solenoid, and this is the EGR vent solenoid. So when you're applying vacuum, comes through here, and then this guy actuates the EGR, and when it's done and you go like wide open throttle or it's a cold start or whatever, and you don't want EGR function, it then vents that vacuum through this line, rigid line. We come back over here. That's the line that goes to the rear of the air box. That's this one. EGR vent solenoid goes to the rear of the air box. The other line here is to the canister purge valve. So the charcoal canister off of your fuel tank, fuel vapors come through, go into that little black chamber on the firewall. This guy right here pulls those fuel vapors and introduces them into the intake manifold via the purge control solenoid. So this line right here goes via this rigid line back over here, the top one to the tank. So top line here is the tank. The bottom one comes over here, gets dumped into the intake manifold right behind the throttle body. Bottom gets burned. So this solenoid always has vacuum applied to the bottom. And whenever it's energized, it just pulls fuel vapors through the line, through the solenoid, and right into the intake manifold. There's your brake booster. So if you need to go in and replace any of these lines, like I just replaced this one because it was cracked on the solenoid, actually had both of them broken off. Understand where it goes to by understanding the function of the solenoid. So vent is here, vacuum control is here. So if you ever pull the intake manifold off, it's a good idea to remove one from the intake side and remove one from the solenoid side. And then when you remove the intake manifold, because that's your little, oh, that's an infamous bolt right there that everybody hates. It's easy to get onto, just use a deep well socket and it goes right on there, not a big deal. But when you loosen that one and get it out so you can pull the intake manifold off, take one line from the intake manifold and one line from your solenoid, so when you go to put it back together, you can't screw it up. Now, other things to deal with are the ones on the front of the intake manifold. So let's spin this guy around real quick. So, 93 through 95 intake manifolds have two solenoid control nipples, basically. You've got one right here. This is your fuel pressure regulator. And it goes to the little black solenoid there, and it's fed with vacuum via this guy. Or this guy. Doesn't matter. One of these goes to cruise control, one of them goes to the fuel pressure regulator control solenoid. Function of it basically is for super high temperature areas. And what it does basically is it always applies vacuum to this to give you around 40 psi of fuel, plus or minus, depending on how old your car is and how old your fuel pump is. So this little guy, when vacuum is applied to it, it applies pressure on the diaphragm to the fuel flow coming in this rail, over the hump, down here, hits a wall. This is what controls your fuel pressure. So in high heat situations where the vehicle is prone to boiling fuel, because remember this is an oven and that's an oven and everything's metal and it's trying to cook your fuel, what the fuel pressure regulator control solenoid does is cut vacuum to this guy. And when vacuum is not applied to it, it actually decreases fuel pressure. It removes the resistance against the fuel pressure. And you think, well, why would it do that? You want more fuel. Well, you do get more fuel because you've increased your flow of fuel going through and out of the fuel rail. So you're actually essentially cooling it because you're flowing more fuel because you have lower fuel pressure. So that's how that guy works. It's a little black solenoid located right about here. If your air box is right here and this guy lives right here. On 96 and 97 cars, you guys have this. And you can thank all the tree-hugging hippies for this guy. What this is a manifold air pressure sensor. And it works just like the EGR solenoids, where it's a two-step system. Vacuum goes to the other black solenoid that looks just like the fuel pressure regulator control solenoid. And then it comes out of that one and goes to the little map sensor. And the map sensor is the one that everybody hates. It's code 1195, I believe. The reason this is here is because it checks the flow of EGR gases into the intake manifold. So you see, you've got this kind of casting right here. This is the EGR passage. So when we go to the engine, you've got the EGR mounted back here. Let's turn the light on. You've got the EGR right here. EGR bolts to the head right here. EGR gases flow in the head. If you can see this casting right here. Well, let's go over here. That's your EGR casting. EGR gases are flowing. This is basically a tube under the metal. Comes up to here. Right in there is flow into your intake. How? Well, through that hole. This hole right here. So from the EGR, pipe feeds the EGR valve, EGR opens up, EGR gases are flowing here, they come here, they go up into the intake manifold. Which is why that is so gross on intake manifolds. That's your EGR gas passage. And it goes up and gets dumped into the intake right behind the throttle body. Basically what happens is when the EGR is turned on, the manifold air pressure sensor senses the manifold air pressure changing because you've basically effectively got a vacuum leak. New gases that are unmetered by the intake tract are being introduced into the intake manifold at speed. So the ECU is like, yes, we want that. We know it's coming. The manifold air pressure sensor tells the ECU that yes, the manifold air pressure has changed, and therefore the EGR is working properly. So if you throw that code, it could be any number of things going on here. It may not be just a bad sensor. It could very well be one of these is lazy. It could be your EGR is lazy. But it wants to see a flow change in the intake manifold pressure, thereby saying that your car is a good tree-hugging hippie, and all of the trees and the rabbits are going to live forever. So, that's it. Oh, one little guy right here. This little guy right here, see that guy? That's the one oddball. This goes to your HVAC. On this car, it popped off. This is a rigid line. Well, a plastic rigid. It's not like the rubber ones that you find everywhere else on the intake. But this guy right here, if you pull your intake manifold off and you forget to put that on and you fire the car up and it's got a vacuum leak and it only blows out of your defrost, you didn't hook that up. That goes to the box here. This is a vacuum chamber and it's got a check valve on it and everything. But this is what feeds your HVAC on Ford probes. MX-6, they're electronic, so they don't have that. But that's how it works. Hope that helps. It's long-winded. I apologize. I apologize for my band-aided finger. But that is your intake manifold. That's how it works. Everything is just vacuum. Some are unimpeded, so your canister purge hits the solenoid and goes right to the intake manifold. Some of them are controlled by solenoids with check valves, which is your supply here. And some of them are the two-step controls, like the EGR as well as the manifold air pressure sensor for OBD2 cars. Hope that helps. Somebody may get helped by it, and if one person gets helped, then it was worth my time. Have a good one.